Good afternoon. My name is Sedlack, and I'm a 2L here at Maine Law. Last semester I took a class with Professor Riggins called Race, Sexual Orientation, and Gender. In that class, I started a project based on the 28-year campaign it took to include sexual orientation as a protected class in the Maine Human Rights Act. In the beginning of that project, I ended up at the USM Special Collection Library, and I started reading through the legislative record and reading pretty about the offensive things that people would say on the floor. So one example of that is from 1979, which was the first year that they tried to attempt to pass this legislation. So the story goes like this. One person is speaking against the bill being passed, and he's talking and he refers to LGBTQ+ as a bunch of creepy crawlers. Somebody else stands up and said, "Point of order, can we please refer to them as human beings?" The speaker responds, "No, I can't refer to them as human beings, but I refer to them as people, the lowest form of people." So this is why we need this protection. Because although that was in 1979, this type of language has continued to today. And so I only have 5 minutes to talk about the 28 years it took. I'll try my best. So the Maine Human Rights Act was established in 1971, and it did not include sexual orientation as a protected class in the beginning. Starting in 1979, there were 14 attempts to include it. So two things that I found when I was reading through the legislative record. The first was whether or not it was even necessary. One senator spoke about how he didn't think that there were any gay people here in the state of Maine. As the years went on, they talked about the AIDS epidemic and how, well, maybe it was needed for the heterosexual people. This continued all the way through 2005. The second theme I found was the perceived morality of the issue. So even though legislators might be speaking in for it, they would always make sure they would let their voters know they didn't condone this lifestyle, or they felt sorry for people who were gay. So starting in 2005, they started passing what it finally became, and this had all the same drama as it had before. Passed the legislation, governor signed it, but it was stalled by a people's veto. This meant that the legislation went to referendum in November. And so the people finally voted that they wanted to have this as a part of the Maine Human Rights Act. So the rest of my presentation is about how this protection has been important here in the state of Maine. I specifically looked at the field of public education. So one of the cases I looked at was from June 2012. A mother filed a complaint with the Maine Human Rights Act saying that her son had been abused and harassed for the past 2 years at his public school. He had been abused because of his perceived sexual orientation. This is an important thing to note, that it doesn't matter if you're actually a part of this class. If you're being harassed because people think that you are, you can still be protected by it. So this mother alleged that her son had been abused for the past 2 years, that people had performed multiple gay tests on him, that they had barged into him while he was in the locker room. There was an alleged sexual assault that led to him being hospitalized for suicide ideation. So the school was allowed to file a response, and they talked about all the great practices in place. They talked about how he was a great student and that he was loved by his community. They also addressed certain allegations. So for example, with the locker room, when students barged into him when he was changing, they said that the gym teacher said he was just taking too long in the stall and that his other classmates just really wanted to get to class. So after the response and complaint were filed, the commission began their own investigation. They studied the evidence based on the unlawful discrimination standard, and ultimately they held the events were because of his perceived sexual orientation and the membership in this class. They held the school liable because although they mentioned the good practices that they didn't do enough in this instance. This went on for 2 years, and instead of dealing with it on a case-by-case basis, they should have done more to change the culture of the school. So they encouraged the two parties to settle, which they did, which was not on record. So in conclusion, I ended up reading a newspaper article where a legislator talked about how in 2004, a member of the Christian League came up to Augusta and was telling people that he was going to publicly list everybody who was gay on his website. He was going to out people who weren't gay and tell everybody who they were voting for. So he talked about how he sat in fear that his constituents were going to find out that he was gay. A year later, in 2005, when it was passed, he ended up standing up and talking in favor of this bill. He came out as gay in order to say, as he said, the discrimination happened to people you know. It's not always nameless, faceless people. So it may have taken 28 years to include this in the Maine Human Rights Act, but it is a critical piece of legislation that is important to protect the rights of Mainers. So I'll be afterwards in the lobby if you have any other questions, but I'm excited to pass it off to my fellow students. So thank you.